Captain Jake Morrison was drinking his morning coffee when the message arrived. He sat in his captain's chair aboard the Columbus, watching the stars through the main window. The ship was quiet except for the soft hum of the engines. Jake liked these peaceful moments before his crew woke up. The communication panel beeped 3 times. Jake set down his coffee cup and pressed the button. A hologram appeared in front of him. It showed the official seal of the Galactic Court of Justice. Jake had been waiting for this message for 2 months. Message from Kepler Station Galactic Court, the computer announced. Priority level, high. Jake leaned forward as the hologram began to speak. The image showed Judge Administrator Kelnara, a tall blue alien with 4 arms. Her voice was calm and formal. Captain Morrison of Earth Vessel Columbus. Your appeal regarding mining rights in the Tau Ceti system has been approved for court hearing. Date scheduled. Galactic Standard Time 2:47.3. Location, Kepler Station, Court Chamber 7. Jake smiled. Earth needed those mining rights badly. The colonies were running low on rare metals. This was good news. But then Judge Kelnara continued speaking, and Jake's smile faded. Please note special protocol for this hearing. As per Galactic Court Regulation 847B, all legal proceedings involving human participants require the presence of a Class A armored bailiff. This bailiff must be equipped with full combat armor, energy shields, and stun weapons. The courtroom will be reinforced with blast-resistant barriers. Jake stared at the hologram. He played the message again to make sure he heard correctly. Class A armored bailiff? Blast-resistant barriers? What kind of court hearing was this? Additionally, the message continued. All human participants must undergo security screening before entering the courtroom. Any loud vocalizations, sudden movements, or aggressive gestures will result in immediate case dismissal. Please acknowledge receipt of this message within 24 hours. The hologram disappeared. Jake sat in silence for several minutes. He had been to many court hearings before. None of them required armed guards or reinforced walls. What made Earth cases so different? Jake pressed the intercom button. Lisa Grant to the bridge, please. Lisa Grant to the bridge. Lisa was the ship's legal advisor. She was smart and knew more about space law than anyone Jake had ever met. If anyone could explain this strange message, it would be Lisa. 5 minutes later, Lisa walked onto the bridge. She was a small woman with short brown hair and sharp green eyes. She carried a tablet computer and looked alert despite the early hour. Good morning, Captain. What's the emergency? Jake replayed the message for Lisa. He watched her face as she listened. Her eyebrows went up when she heard about the armored bailiff. By the end of the message, she looked completely confused. That's unusual, Lisa said slowly. I've never heard of anything like this. What's Regulation 847B? Jake asked. Lisa tapped on her tablet, searching through legal databases. I don't know. I'm looking it up now. She frowned at the screen. That's strange. This regulation doesn't exist in any of my legal files. Maybe it's new? Maybe. Lisa kept searching. Or maybe it's so specific that only the court has copies. But Jake, this doesn't make sense. The Galactic Court is famous for being peaceful. They resolve disputes through meditation and calm discussion. Why would they need armed guards for our case? Jake stood up and walked to the window. Outside, space looked the same as always. Stars, darkness, and the distant glow of nebulae. But something was different now. Something had changed in how the galaxy saw Earth. Have other human ships had court cases recently? Jake asked. Lisa nodded. Several. The merchant ship Liberty had a trade dispute 6 months ago. Before that, there was that boundary case with the rescue mission. Both cases were resolved in our favor. Did they have special security requirements? I don't know. Court records usually don't include security details. Lisa looked up from her tablet. But I can contact the other captains and ask. Jake walked back to his chair. Do that, and send a message to Admiral Kane on Earth. He needs to know about this. Lisa nodded and started typing on her tablet. Jake watched her work. Something was bothering him, but he couldn't figure out what it was. The message had been polite and formal, but there was something underneath. Something that felt like fear. "Captain," Lisa said without looking up, "I found something interesting. The Galactic Court has never used Class A bailiffs before. The highest security level on record is Class C, and that was only used once for a war crimes trial." "What does that mean?" "It means they think we're extremely dangerous." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "Dangerous? We're asking for mining rights, not declaring war." "I know. That's what makes this so strange." Lisa finished typing and looked at Jake. "I'm going to research every human court case from the past 5 years. There has to be an explanation for this." The next few hours passed slowly. Jake went about his normal duties, but his mind kept returning to the message. Why did the aliens think humans were dangerous in court? What had happened to make them so afraid? Lisa worked in the ship's small library, surrounded by legal documents and case files. She barely looked up when Jake brought her lunch. "Find anything?" Jake asked. "Bits and pieces. The boundary case with Commander Rogers was intense. The trade dispute with Captain Turner got heated, but nothing that should require armed guards." Jake sat down across from Lisa. "Define intense and heated." Lisa pulled up a file on her tablet. "Well, Commander Rogers gave a very passionate speech about human values. Captain Turner spoke quite firmly about economic needs. Both cases involved strong emotional arguments. That's normal for humans, isn't it? When we care about something, we speak with passion." "Yes, but—" Lisa paused. "Jake, what if that's the problem? What if other species don't argue the same way we do?" Jake thought about this. He had met many alien species during his years in space. Most of them were quiet and polite. They spoke softly and rarely showed strong emotions. Even when they disagreed, they did it calmly. "You think we scare them when we argue?" "It's possible. Think about it. Humans get loud when we're passionate. We gesture with our hands. We raise our voices. We pound on tables to make our points. What if other species see that as aggressive behavior?" Jake remembered his last argument with his ex-wife. He had raised his voice and waved his arms around. She had called him scary when he got like that. If his own wife found his passionate arguing frightening, what would alien species think? "But we win our cases," Jake said. "If we scare them, why do they rule in our favor?" Lisa looked at him with wide eyes. "Jake, what if we win because we scare them? What if they're too afraid to rule against us?" The idea hit Jake like a punch to the stomach. All those victories, all those successful negotiations, had humanity been bullying the galaxy without knowing it? "We need to contact Admiral Kane immediately," Jake said. Lisa was already reaching for the communication panel. As she started the call, Jake looked out at the stars again. Somewhere out there, aliens were preparing armored bailiffs to protect themselves from human lawyers. The thought made him sick. The communication panel crackled to life. Admiral Kane's familiar voice filled the bridge. "Columbus, this is Earth Command. Admiral Kane speaking. Admiral, this is Captain Morrison. We have a problem, a big one." Jake began to explain the situation. As he talked, he could hear the concern growing in the Admiral's voice. This wasn't just about mining rights anymore. This was about humanity's place in the galaxy. And Jake was starting to realize that their place might not be what they thought it was. Admiral Kane's voice crackled through the communication system. "Morrison, I need to tell you something. Something we should have shared with all captains months ago." Jake and Lisa exchanged worried looks. The Admiral's tone was serious, more serious than Jake had ever heard before. 3 years ago, we had our first major case in the Galactic Court," Admiral Kane continued. "Commander Steve Rogers and his crew were accused of violating territorial boundaries during a rescue mission. It seemed like a simple case at the time. Jake remembered hearing about that mission. Rogers had saved over 200 civilians from a space station that was about to explode. The station was in disputed territory, but Rogers didn't hesitate to help. Jake had always thought Rogers was a hero. "What happened in court?" Lisa asked. "Let me patch you through to Rogers himself. He's here on Earth now. retired from active duty. Maybe he can explain it better than I can. The communication line went quiet for a moment. Then a new voice came through, deeper and older than the Admiral's. "This is Steve Rogers. Captain Morrison, is it?" "Yes, sir. We'd like to know what happened during your court case." Steve was quiet for several seconds. When he spoke again, his voice sounded tired. "I thought I was defending my crew and my actions. I thought I was explaining why we had to save those people. But looking back now, I think I might have terrified everyone in that courtroom." Jake felt his stomach tighten. "Can you tell us exactly what happened?" "The case started normally enough," Steve began. "The prosecutor was this insect-like creature called a Zentaurian, very thin, with big compound eyes and delicate movements. She spoke so quietly I could barely hear her. Lisa was taking notes on her tablet. What was the charge? Violation of territorial boundaries. The Zentaurian prosecutor said we entered Vegan Confederation space without permission. She was right, technically, but there were people dying on that station." Jake could hear the emotion building in Steve's voice even through the communication system. "My legal advisor was Amy Parker. Good lawyer, very smart. She tried to keep things calm and professional. But when the prosecutor started talking about rules and regulations while people had been dying, I couldn't stay quiet." "What did you do?" "I stood up. Amy tried to stop me, but I had to speak. I told them about the families on that station. The children, the elderly people who couldn't evacuate fast. I explained that humans don't abandon people in danger no matter what the rules say." Jake nodded. That sounded reasonable to him. Any human would understand that argument. "The prosecutor started shaking," Steve continued. "At first I thought she was cold. The courtroom was kept at a temperature comfortable for all species, which meant it was pretty chilly for humans. But then I realized she was trembling with fear." "Fear? Of what?" "Of me. Of my voice." I was speaking louder than I realized, trying to make sure everyone could hear me. My voice carries in small spaces. Always has, even when I try to keep it down. Lisa looked up from her notes. "How loud?" "Well, Amy told me later that I was nearly shouting. But I didn't feel like I was shouting. I felt like I was just speaking with conviction." Jake remembered times when he had spoken with conviction. Usually when he was passionate about something important. His voice would get stronger, more forceful. He had never thought of it as shouting. "What happened next?" "I kept talking. I told them about the moral duty to help others. I explained that humans believe life is more important than political boundaries. I described how my crew risked their lives to save complete strangers." Steve paused. Jake could hear him take a deep breath. I was getting more emotional as I talked. These were my crew members who had shown incredible courage. I was proud of them. I wanted the court to understand that we had done the right thing. "And the aliens?" The Zentaurian prosecutor was backing away from me. She kept looking around like she wanted to run. Judge Kolrath, this amphibian creature from the oceanic rings, was making these high-pitched noises that Amy later told me were distress calls. Jake felt sick. Steve Rogers was one of the most honorable men in the space fleet. If he had frightened aliens just by defending his crew, what did that say about humanity? "I didn't realize what was happening," Steve continued. "I thought they were just paying attention to my argument, so I kept going. I talked about sacrifice and duty and the human spirit. I gestured with my hands to emphasize my points." Lisa looked at Jake. "Gestured how?" "Nothing threatening, just normal hand movements, pointing to emphasize a fact, spreading my arms wide when I talked about the scope of the rescue mission, clenching my fist when I talked about determination." To Jake, this sounded like normal, human behavior. He gestured when he talked too, especially when he was excited or passionate about something. But the aliens saw it differently? "I think so." The whole courtroom was backing away from me. Spectators were leaving their seats. Some aliens were making clicking or whistling sounds that Amy said were fear responses. Jake could picture the scene. Steve Rogers, A large man with a powerful voice standing in a courtroom full of small, delicate aliens, speaking passionately about human values while gesturing with his hands. To the aliens, it must have looked like an attack. What about, Amy, what was she doing? She was trying to calm me down without being obvious about it. She kept tugging on my sleeve and whispering for me to lower my voice. But I was in the middle of making my point. I thought she was just nervous about the case. Steve's voice got quieter. I finished my speech by saying that humans would never apologize for saving lives. I said we would do it again without hesitation, regardless of the consequences. I meant it as a statement of principle. How did the court react? Complete silence. For about 30 seconds, nobody moved or made a sound. Then Judge Colrath cleared his throat and said they would take a recess to consider the arguments. Jake waited for Steve to continue. During the recess, Amy pulled me aside and told me that the entire alien section of the courtroom had emptied. She said she had never seen anything like it. Even the court reporters had left. What did you think was happening? I thought they were impressed by my passion. I thought I had made a strong case for human values. I felt good about it, Lisa shook her head. But they were terrified. Yes. When court resumed, Judge Colrath was wearing some kind of protective suit. He had never worn one before, according to the court records Amy checked later. The Zentorian prosecutor spoke from behind a clear barrier. Jake felt worse with every detail. Did you win the case? Yes. The court ruled in our favor immediately. Judge Colrath said that humanity's commitment to preserving life was admirable, and that our actions were justified under emergency rescue protocols. That sounds good. It would have been, except for what Judge Colrath said at the end. He recommended that all future human court cases include enhanced security measures to ensure the safety of all participants. The pieces were starting to fit together in Jake's mind. The enhanced security measures had grown over time, case by case, until they reached the current requirement for armored bailiffs. Steve, did you know you were scaring them? Not at the time. I thought I was just being a good advocate for my crew. It wasn't until months later, when I heard about other human cases requiring extra security, that I started to understand. Admiral Kane's voice cut back into the conversation. Rogers, tell them about the follow-up meeting. Right. A few weeks after the case, I was contacted by a galactic court mediator, a very polite creature called a harmonizer. It wanted to understand human communication patterns. What did it ask? It asked if raising our voices was a prelude to physical violence. It asked if our hand gestures were threat displays. It asked if our emotional intensity indicated an intention to attack. Jake closed his eyes. The picture was becoming clear, and it wasn't pretty. I tried to explain that humans are just naturally expressive, that we show passion when we care about something, that our emotions run close to the surface, especially when we're defending something important. Did it understand? I think it tried to. But the mediator kept asking about our fight-or-flight responses and our evolutionary background as predators. It seemed convinced that human courtroom behavior was some kind of intimidation tactic. Lisa looked up from her notes. Steve, do you think that's why you won your case? Because they were too afraid to rule against you? Steve was quiet for a long time. I've been wondering about that for 3 years now. And honestly, I think the answer might be yes. The communication line fell silent. Jake stared out at the stars, trying to process everything he had heard. Humanity's greatest courtroom victories might have been built on fear rather than justice. Admiral, Jake said finally, how many other cases have there been since then? 6 major cases, all victories, all with increasing security requirements. Jake looked at Lisa. She was pale and looked as sick as he felt. We've been bullying the galaxy, Lisa whispered. Jake nodded slowly, without even knowing it. Admiral Kane's voice came through the communication system again. Morrison, there's more you need to know. Rogers' case was just the beginning. 6 months later, things got much worse. Jake felt his stomach drop. If Steve Rogers' case had been the start of the security measures, what could have been worse? Tell us about it, Lisa said, her fingers ready over her tablet. Captain Rick Turner and the merchant vessel Liberty. They had a trade dispute with the Vegan Confederation. Turner was a good captain, fair and honest. But he made the same mistake Rogers did. Jake had heard of Rick Turner. The man had a reputation for being tough but reasonable. He ran cargo between human colonies and alien worlds. Jake had always respected him. What was the dispute about? Jake asked. Mining restrictions. The Vegans wanted to limit human mining operations on 3 planets in their territory. They said our methods were too aggressive for their liking. Turner's cargo runs depended on those mining operations. Lisa looked up from her notes. Who represented the humans? Environmental lawyer Kate Sullivan. She was brilliant, one of the best legal minds we had. She specialized in interspecies environmental law. If anyone could handle the Vegans, it was Kate. Admiral Kane paused. Jake could hear papers rustling. In the background, I'm going to patch you through to Turner. He's currently stationed at Mars Colony. He can tell you what happened better than I can. The communication line switched. A new voice came through, rough and tired. This is Rick Turner. You want to know about the worst day of my career? If you don't mind sharing, Jake said carefully. Rick laughed, but there was no humor in it. Mind? I think about it every night. Kate and I thought we were walking into a simple trade negotiation. We had no idea we were about to start an interstellar incident. Jake settled back in his chair. Lisa's pen was ready. The Vegan Confederation sent 3 representatives. They were these plant-based creatures that looked like walking trees, beautiful in their own way. They moved very slowly and spoke through chemical releases that had to be translated. Chemical releases? Pheromones. They communicate by releasing different scents into the air. Very subtle, very peaceful. The translator system turned their chemical messages into words we could understand. Jake nodded. He had heard of species that communicated through smell or chemical signals. It sounded complicated but peaceful. Kate started the presentation. She had prepared for weeks, studying vegan culture and environmental concerns. She began, very calmly, explaining the human position on the mining restrictions. What was the human position? That the restrictions were too harsh. The mining operations provided jobs for thousands of human families. The rare minerals we extracted were essential for our colony ships and medical equipment. Kate had all the facts and figures ready. Rick paused. Jake could hear him take a deep breath. At first, everything went fine. Kate spoke in her normal voice, which is pretty soft for a human. The Vegans seemed to be listening, releasing small puffs of what the translator said were acknowledgement scents. When did things go wrong? About 20 minutes into Kate's presentation, she was explaining the economic impact of the restrictions on human colonies. As she talked about families losing their jobs and children going without medical care, her voice started to get stronger. Jake knew what was coming. He had seen Kate Sullivan speak at conferences. When she cared about something, her whole personality changed. She became more forceful, more passionate. Kate wasn't shouting. Rick continued. Not by human standards, but her voice was getting louder as she explained how many people would suffer if the mining stopped. She was speaking from the heart about human families and their needs. Lisa looked at Jake. They both knew where this was going. What were the vegans doing? They started releasing different scents. The translator kept saying things like concern pheromones and distress chemicals. But Kate and I didn't understand what that meant at the time. Jake could picture the scene. Kate, growing more passionate as she defended human families. The vegans, releasing fear chemicals that she couldn't even smell. Kate kept going. She talked about human children who needed the medical equipment made from those rare minerals. She described elderly colonists who depended on the mining jobs for their retirement. She was making a beautiful emotional argument for human needs. And her voice kept getting louder? Yes. And she started gesturing. Kate always used her hands when she spoke about something important. She would point to her charts and graphs. She would spread her arms wide when talking about the scope of the problem. She would clench her fists when she talked about the unfairness of the restrictions. Jake winced. Hand gestures that seemed natural to humans probably looked like threats to peaceful plant creatures. The Vegans were backing away from the table. 2 of them had moved to the far side of the room, but Kate was focused on her presentation. She didn't notice. What happened next? I joined in. Kate was doing such a good job explaining the situation that I wanted to support her. I stood up and started talking about my cargo runs and the families I knew personally. Rick's voice got quieter. I used my command voice. You know, the voice captains use when they need to be heard over engine noise or in an emergency. It's louder and more forceful than normal conversation. Jake knew that voice well. Every ship captain developed it. It was the voice of authority, the voice that could cut through chaos and get attention. It was also much louder than normal human speech. I told them about Maria Santos, a single mother who worked in the lithium mines, about old George Chen, who had been mining rare earth elements for 30 years, about the Rodriguez family who had 5 children and depended on the mining income. You were trying to put human faces on the statistics? Exactly. I wanted them to understand that these weren't just numbers. These were real people with real lives. I spoke with the kind of passion I felt for my cargo crews and their families. Lisa was scribbling notes frantically. How did the Vegans react? They went into some kind of defensive mode. The translator started saying things like emergency pheromones and threat response chemicals. 2 of the 3 Vegans collapsed into what looked like protective shells. Jake felt sick. Collapsed? They pulled their branch-like arms tight against their bodies and stopped moving. The translator said it was their species' natural defense against predators. They thought we were attacking them. The room fell silent except for the hum of the ship's engines. Jake tried to imagine how terrifying it must have been for creatures that communicated through gentle chemical signals to face 2 humans speaking loudly and gesturing emphatically. The 3rd Vegan was still conscious, but it was releasing what the translator called panic sense. The smell was so strong that it triggered the courtroom's air filtration system. What did you and Kate do? We tried to calm down, but the damage was done. Kate lowered her voice and apologized, but the Vegans couldn't respond. Their defensive shells were sealed tight. Rick sighed heavily. The judge was a gaseous being called Melandra from the Nebula worlds. She was floating in a containment field, and as Kate and I had gotten more passionate, the judge's form had become more and more unstable. Unstable how? Gaseous beings hold their shape through conscious effort. Strong emotions or stress can cause them to lose cohesion. Judge Melandra was flickering like a candle in the wind. Jake closed his eyes. A judge literally losing physical form because of human courtroom behavior. When I finished my speech about the human families, I pounded the table once for emphasis. Just once to drive home my point about the unfairness of the situation. Lisa looked up. What happened? The sound echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. Judge Melandra dispersed completely. Her containment field went into emergency mode, trying to hold her together. Alarms started going off. Jake could barely speak. Alarms. Medical emergency alarms. Security alarms. The court's safety systems thought there was an attack in progress. Security forces surrounded the building within minutes. Rick's voice was barely a whisper now. Kate and I just stood there, confused and terrified. We had no idea what we had done wrong. We thought we were giving a good presentation about human needs. How did it end? The case was postponed indefinitely. Judge Melandra had to be taken to a medical facility for reassembly. The Vegan representatives were unconscious for 6 hours. Kate and I were escorted out by armed guards. Lisa set down her pen. Did you ever find out what the aliens thought happened? Later, yes. The court sent a mediator to explain. They thought Kate and I had been deliberately intimidating the Vegans. They believed our loud voices and forceful gestures were threats designed to make the Vegans submit to our demands. But you were just advocating for human families. That's what we tried to explain. But the mediator said that from the alien perspective, we had demonstrated classic predator behavior, loud vocalizations, aggressive posturing, and dominant physical presence. Jake felt the weight of understanding settling on him. Rick, did you win the case when it was eventually heard? Yes. The Vegans agreed to reduce the mining restrictions significantly, but I don't think it was because our arguments were good. I think they were too afraid to say no to us. Admiral Kane's voice cut back into the conversation. Admiral Kane's voice came through the communication system one more time. Morrison, what I'm about to tell you is classified information. The final incident that led to the armored bailiff requirement happened 8 months ago. It almost got humanity banned from the Galactic Court permanently. Jake felt his hands getting cold. If the previous cases had been bad, what could have been worse than a judge losing physical form and an entire species going into defensive shutdown? Who was involved? Lisa asked, her pen ready. Captain Dan Cole of the colony ship Endeavor and Prosecutor Helen Brooks. They were defending against charges of ecological disruption on the planet New Eden. Jake knew both names. Dan Cole was famous for establishing the most successful human colony outside the Sol system. Helen Brooks was a prosecutor known for her fierce dedication to justice. Both were respected leaders in the human community. What were the charges, exactly? Jake asked. The human colony on New Eden had accidentally introduced Earth bacteria that enhanced the growth of native plants. The indigenous Florians considered this a violation of their natural order. Lisa looked up from her notes. Accidentally? Completely. The bacteria came from the colonists' digestive systems. Despite all their precautions, some Earth microbes escaped into the environment. The bacteria didn't harm anything. In fact, it made the Florian plants grow bigger and stronger. That sounds beneficial. To humans, yes. But the Florians have a very strict philosophy about natural purity. Any change to their ecosystem, even positive change, is considered a serious crime. Jake could understand both sides. Humans would see bigger, healthier plants as an improvement. But if the Florians valued their environment exactly as it was, any change would be upsetting. I'm going to connect you with Helen Brooks. She's currently at the law school on Europa, teaching interspecies legal ethics. The communication line switched. A new voice came through, strong and clear. This is Helen Brooks. Admiral Kane asked me to tell you about the New Eden case. I have to warn you, it's not a pleasant story. Jake settled in his chair. We need to understand what happened. The case was more complex than the previous ones because it involved indigenous rights. The Florians claimed that humans had permanently damaged their sacred ecosystem. They wanted us to remove all colonists from New Eden and pay massive compensation. What was your defense? That the bacterial introduction was accidental and actually beneficial. I had prepared extensive scientific evidence showing that the enhanced plant growth was helping the Florian ecosystem become more robust and productive. Helen paused. Jake could hear her taking a deep breath. Captain Cole and I thought we had a strong case. The science was on our side. The colonists had followed all contamination protocols, and the results were objectively positive for the planet. What went wrong? Everything. From the moment we walked into that courtroom, I knew something was different. There were more security guards than I had ever seen. Energy barriers separated the human section from the rest of the court. Even the judge's bench was enclosed in what looked like a protective bubble. Lisa was writing furiously. Who was the judge? Judge Quallen, an ancient energy being who had presided over galactic courts for over 3 centuries. She was known for her wisdom and fairness. She had never used protective equipment before, according to the court records. Jake felt a chill. If a judge with 3 centuries of experience felt the need for protection from humans, the situation was worse than he had imagined. The Florian representatives were these delicate, flower-like beings. They moved like they were dancing, very graceful and peaceful. They spoke in musical tones that had to be translated into words. How did the case begin? Normally at first, the Florian prosecutor sang a beautiful melody about the sanctity of their ecosystem. The translator converted it into legal language, about environmental protection and indigenous rights. Helen's voice grew tighter. But as she sang about the bacterial contamination, I could see that she was describing it like a violent invasion. To the Florians, our accidentally introduced bacteria was like an army conquering their world. What was your response? I began my defense calmly. I explained that the contamination was accidental and showed the scientific data proving that the bacterial enhancement was beneficial. I thought logic and evidence would win the day. Jake knew Helen's reputation. She was logical and methodical, not the type to lose control in court. For the first hour, things went well. I presented my evidence clearly and professionally. Judge Quallen seemed interested in the scientific data. The Florians listened politely to the translation. When did things change? When Captain Cole began his testimony, he started describing the colony's efforts to coexist peacefully with the Florians. He talked about the precautions they had taken and the careful environmental monitoring they had conducted. Jake could picture Dan Cole. He was a big man with a commanding presence, used to leading thousands of colonists through the challenges of establishing a new world. Dan spoke with the authority of someone who had personally overseen every aspect of the colony. His voice carried the confidence of a leader who had successfully established humanity's most important off-world settlement. That doesn't sound threatening. It wasn't meant to be. But Dan's command voice is very powerful. When he talks about his colony, you can hear the pride and determination in every word. He speaks like someone who has faced impossible challenges and overcome them. Helen paused again. The Florians started responding negatively to Dan's testimony. They began making high-pitched musical sounds that the translator said were distress calls. Jake was starting to see the pattern. Human confidence and authority sounded like aggression to species that had evolved differently. I tried to keep the focus on the scientific evidence, but I was getting frustrated. The Florians were treating accidental bacterial contamination like deliberate environmental warfare. Their arguments weren't logical. What did you do? I raised my voice. Not shouting, just speaking more forcefully to emphasize my points. I gestured toward my evidence charts to make sure everyone could see the data clearly. Jake winced. By now he knew that raised voices and gestures were exactly the wrong things to do in an alien courtroom. The more frustrated I became with their illogical position, the more passionate I became about defending the colony. These were good people who had worked hard to build a peaceful settlement. They didn't deserve to be punished for an accident. How did the court react? Judge Quallen's energy form started flickering. The Florians were backing away from their speaking area. Security guards moved closer to the human section. Helen's voice got quieter. But I was so focused on making my argument that I didn't notice the reactions around me. I kept pushing harder, trying to make them understand the unfairness of their position. What was the breaking point? I was making a point about the colony's environmental safeguards when I gestured broadly toward the evidence display. My hand accidentally knocked over a ceremonial water vessel that belonged to the aquatic tribunal. Jake felt his stomach drop. Ceremonial? Sacred. The crystal vessel had been blessed by the aquatic priests and contained water from their homeworld. It had been used in court ceremonies for over 1,000 years. Oh no. The sound of breaking crystal echoed through the chamber like an explosion. In the dead silence that followed, everyone stared at the shattered pieces on the floor. Jake could imagine the horror of that moment. A 1,000-year-old sacred object destroyed by a careless gesture during a heated argument. I tried to apologize immediately, but Dan's voice boomed across the courtroom before I could speak. He declared that humans would not be intimidated by false accusations and would stand by their principles no matter what. He was trying to support you? Yes, but his timing couldn't have been worse. His voice filled the entire chamber with what sounded like a battle cry. To the aliens, it must have seemed like we had deliberately destroyed their sacred object and then declared war on the court. Helen's voice was barely a whisper now. What happened next was chaos. Judge Quallen flickered so violently that the court's energy containment systems went into emergency mode. Several Florian representatives collapsed unconscious. The aquatic tribunal members fled the chamber completely. How bad was it? Security forces surrounded our section within seconds. Evacuation alarms started going off. The court's medical teams were called in to treat multiple alien witnesses for shock and trauma. Jake closed his eyes. This was worse than anything he had imagined. Judge Quallen had to be stabilized by medical technicians. She flickered on and off for nearly an hour before they could get her energy form stable enough to speak. What did she say? That in 3 centuries of presiding over galactic courts, she had never seen such a display of aggressive intimidation. She said that humanity's courtroom behavior was incompatible with civilized legal proceedings. Lisa looked up from her notes. Did you win the case? Yes. The court ruled in our favor immediately. and allowed the colony to remain on New Eden with minimal restrictions. But Judge Quallen made it clear that this was the last time humans would be allowed in her courtroom without maximum security measures. Admiral Kane's voice cut back into the conversation. 1 week later, Jake and Lisa stood outside Court Chamber 7 on Kepler Station. The hallway was unlike anything Jake had ever seen in a court building. Armed guards patrolled every corner. Energy barriers hummed with power. Warning signs in dozens of languages covered the walls. "Remember?" Lisa whispered. Quiet voices, small gestures, no sudden movements. Jake nodded. They had spent the past week practicing what Lisa called alien-friendly communication. Speaking softly, moving slowly, keeping their emotions carefully controlled. It felt unnatural, but it was their only hope. The massive door to the courtroom opened with a heavy clang. Inside, Jake saw what looked more like a military bunker than a place of justice. Thick walls, reinforced barriers, and enough security equipment to stop a small army. Bailiff Vector stood near the entrance. He was a Krillian warrior, 8 feet tall and covered in natural armor plating. His equipment included energy shields, stun weapons, and what looked like a personal force field generator. "Humans, Jake Morrison and Lisa Grant," Vector announced, in a voice like grinding metal. "You are cleared to enter the secure section." Jake and Lisa walked carefully to their designated area. It was surrounded by transparent barriers and monitored by multiple security cameras. They felt like dangerous animals in a zoo. Judge Zixthera sat behind her own protective barrier. She was a crystalline being from the Andorian collective, beautiful but clearly terrified. Her voice came through a heavily filtered communication system. "The court calls the case of Earth Mining Consortium versus Tau Ceti Resource Authority. Please state your business briefly and quietly." Lisa stood up slowly. She had practiced this moment dozens of times. "Your Honor, we respectfully request mining rights for 3 asteroids in the Tau Ceti system. Our proposal includes full environmental protection protocols." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Judge Zixthera leaned forward to hear better. "The opposing party may present their case." The Tau Ceti representative was a floating jellyfish-like creature called a medusoid. It spoke through color changes that were translated into soft musical tones. The Tau Ceti Authority objects to human mining operations due to concerns about aggressive extraction methods and potential environmental damage. Jake felt his anger rising. The asteroids were lifeless rocks floating in empty space. There was no environment to damage, but he forced himself to stay calm. Lisa responded in her careful, quiet voice. "Your Honor, our environmental impact studies show 0 ecological risk. The target asteroids contain no life forms and are not part of any ecosystem." She moved slowly to display a holographic chart. No sudden gestures, no pointing, no emphasis through movement. The medusoid pulsed different colors. Human extraction methods are known to be aggressive and destructive. Their previous mining operations have shown disregard for local concerns. This was a lie, and Jake knew it. Human mining operations were carefully regulated and environmentally responsible, but he bit his tongue and let Lisa handle the response. "Your Honor, we submit evidence of our safety record and environmental compliance." Lisa's voice remained steady and quiet. For an hour, the case continued in this strange, muted way. Lisa presented evidence in whispers. Jake provided testimony in barely audible tones. The medusoid made its arguments through gentle color changes, but as the case progressed, Jake began to notice something. Judge Zixthera was asking very few questions. The medusoid's arguments were weak and unsupported by facts. The whole proceeding felt hollow, like everyone was going through the motions. Then, Jake realized what was happening. Even with all the security measures, even with their quiet voices and careful movements, the aliens were still afraid of them. The case wasn't being decided on its merits. It was being decided by fear. Jake looked at Lisa. She had noticed it too. Her carefully prepared legal arguments were meaningless because the judge was too scared to really listen to them. Something snapped inside Jake. Not anger, but a deep sadness. This wasn't justice. This wasn't how civilized beings should treat each other. The security measures hadn't solved the problem. They had just made it worse. Jake stood up slowly. Vector's hand moved to his weapon, but Jake raised his hands peacefully. "Your honor," Jake said in his normal voice. Not shouting, not commanding, just speaking like a regular human being. "May I say something?" Judge Zixthara trembled behind her barrier. "Please keep your voice down, human." "I will, Your Honor. But I need to tell you something important." Jake's voice was calm but clear. "We've been doing this all wrong." Lisa tugged at his sleeve, trying to get him to sit down, but Jake continued. "Your Honor, my species has been coming to these courts for years. We've won every case. But we never understood why until this week." Vector stepped forward, his weapons ready. Judge Zixthara was shaking visibly. "We win because you're afraid of us," Jake said sadly. "Not because our arguments are good. Not because justice is on our side. You rule in our favor because you think we'll hurt you if you don't." The courtroom fell completely silent. Even the translation system seemed to pause. "That's not justice, Your Honor, that's bullying. And humans don't want to be bullies." Jake looked around the courtroom at all the security measures, all the barriers, all the weapons pointed at him. When humans speak loudly, it's because we care deeply about something. When we gesture with our hands, it's to help you understand our meaning. When we show emotion, it's because the matter is important to us. Judge Zixthara was listening now despite her fear. "But we never realized that our passionate speaking sounds like threats to you. We never understood that our hand movements look like attack signals. We thought we were just being good advocates for our people." Lisa stood up beside Jake. She spoke in her normal voice too, not the careful whisper she had been using. "Your Honor, Captain Morrison is right. We've been accidentally intimidating this court for years. We don't want mining rights because you're afraid to say no. We want them because they're fair and reasonable." Jake nodded. "If our mining proposal isn't good enough to win on its own merits, then we don't deserve those rights. But please, Judge, our case based on facts, not fear." Judge Zixthara was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was still filtered but less distorted. "Human Morrison, are you saying that your species' courtroom behavior is not intended as intimidation?" "No, Your Honor. It's just how we communicate when something matters to us. But we can learn to speak differently in your courts if you'll teach us how. And you would accept a ruling against you without retaliation." Jake felt his heart break a little. "Your Honor, humans believe in justice. If you rule against us fairly, based on the facts, we'll accept that decision with respect." Vector lowered his weapon slightly. Judge Zixthara's trembling stopped. "This is unexpected," she said. "In all my years on the bench, no human has ever acknowledged the court's concerns about their behavior." Lisa stepped forward carefully. "Your Honor, would you be willing to explain how we should behave? In alien courts, we want to learn. We want to do better." Judge Zixthara looked at Vector, then back at the humans. "Most galactic species communicate through subtle methods. Gentle sounds, soft colors, quiet chemical signals. When humans raise their voices and move their bodies emphatically, it appears to us like predatory behavior." Jake nodded. "We understand now. Could you teach us the proper way to present our case?" What followed was the strangest hour of Jake's life. Judge Zixthara, still behind her protective barrier but no longer trembling, explained how different species communicated in legal settings. She taught them about respectful volume levels, appropriate gesture ranges, and emotional restraint. Lisa represented their mining case using these new guidelines. She spoke softly but clearly, moved gently but purposefully, and showed conviction without intimidation. The Metazoid also represented its case, and Jake could see immediately that their arguments were weak and unsupported. Judge Zixthara deliberated for only a few minutes before ruling in favor of the human mining rights. But this time, Jake felt like they had actually won fairly. "This ruling is based on the evidence presented," Judge Zixthara announced. The human proposal shows adequate environmental safeguards and serves the legitimate needs of their colonies. After the session ended, Vector approached Jake and Lisa. For the first time since they had met him, the bailiff removed his helmet. "In 20 years of courtroom security, I have never seen anything like this," he said. "You could have simply accepted another fear-based victory. Why did you choose to reveal the truth?" Jake looked at the barriers and weapons around them. "Because this isn't how civilized beings should treat each other. Fear isn't justice." Judge Zixthara emerged from her protective enclosure. She was still cautious but no longer terrified. "Captain Morrison, would you be willing to help establish a cultural exchange program? Other species need to understand human communication patterns, and humans need to learn how to interact respectfully with different forms of life." "Yes, Your Honor. We'd be honored to help." Over the following months, the Human Galactic Cultural Exchange Program became one of the most successful diplomatic initiatives in galactic history. Human lawyers learned to modulate their voices and gestures for alien audiences. Alien judges learned to distinguish between human passion and human aggression.